Hello, this is Michael Azzato, Self Video 3. This video will focus on policy adoption, which is Chapter 4 in Anderson's Public Policy Making. Policy adoption is the third stage in the policy-making cycle, after agenda setting and policy formulation. Thus, after a public problem is recognized, put on the government's agenda, and proposals are formulated, the government will select a proposed solution to a problem by adopting a policy. Typically, public policy adoption is not a choice between full-blown policy alternatives, but rather action on a preferred policy for which the proponents of action think they can win approval. Policymakers aren't deciding between two entirely different policies, but will vote on a policy after bargains were struck, differences were narrowed, and amendments were made to a bill. Four main groups are involved in policy adoption. These are executives, legislators, administrators, and judges. In order to analyze policy adoption, Anderson explains the various theories of decision-making. First, he notes that there are non-rational and informal ways of making a decision, such as dart throwing, coin flipping, decisions made based on gut instinct and hunches. There are three main theories of decision-making that emphasize the procedure of policy-making and intellectual activities involved in making a decision. They are the rational comprehensive theory, the incremental theory, and the mixed scanning theory. The rational comprehensive theory may be the best known theory. This theory specifies the procedures involved in making rational decisions that maximize the attainment of goals. 6 steps illustrate the rational comprehensive theory. They are: the government faces a problem. Then they evaluate the goals, values, or objectives. Next, they examine alternatives to solving the problem. Then they investigate the consequences, both good and bad, of those alternatives. They weigh the options and compare the alternatives, and finally make a choice on which policy to adopt. The next theory is the incremental theory. This theory is more descriptive of the way in which public officials actually make decisions. Generally, limited changes or additions are made to existing policies. The incremental theory can be summed up by these points. The government selects goals and analyzes actions and recognizes that these are intertwined. The government considers a few alternatives for dealing with a policy, which differ only a bit from existing policies. The government evaluates a limited number of important consequences and modifies the problem continually. The government doesn't see any solution as being the only right solution. The incremental theory is geared toward improving present social imperfections rather than promoting major social goals. Mixed scanning is the third way of decision making. It draws on fundamental and incremental decisions. Anderson gives the example of weather observation to explain mixed scanning. He hypothesizes that there is a need to set up a worldwide weather observation system with satellites. The rationalistic approach to solving this problem would be an exhaustive survey of weather conditions, in which the government should use cameras capable of detailed observation and review the whole sky as often as possible. This would be too overwhelming and costly. Incrementalism would say that we should focus on patterns and regions of the past. A drawback to this would be that we may miss regions that deserve attention. The mixed scanning approach would employ both the rationalistic approach and incrementalism. It would evaluate weather on a broad scale and evaluate areas that deserve attention more closely, thus getting the advantages of both the rationalistic approach and incrementalism. Next, Anderson notes 7 different criteria for making decisions. The first criteria is values. There are many types of values, such as organizational, which are values of agencies and bureaucracies; professional, which are values of people with certain jobs; personal, which are values of policymakers themselves; policy, which are ideals of the policy; and ideological, which are values of conservatives and liberals. Other decision criteria include party affiliation, which is loyalty to Democrats or Republicans; constituency interests, and policymakers follow constituency interests because they want to support the people or they want to get votes. Another decision criteria is public opinion, which is the public view of the problem and how it should be fixed. Another criteria is deference. When policymakers defer, they let other people decide which policy should be adopted. The next criteria are decision rules, which are guidelines for making a decision. And the last criterion is science. Science is especially considered in issues such as the environment, public health, and safety policies. Next, Anderson notes that the task of government should be to serve or promote the public interest. But the public interest is often hard to define. Is the public interest the interest of the majority? And oftentimes it's hard to discover what people want. Also, there might be conflicts of interest, and this is evidenced by competing interest groups. Next, Anderson notes the different styles of decision making. One style is bargaining. In bargaining, 2 or more people adjust their goals so that all accept the policy. This style is the most common. Another style is persuasion, which is arguing for one's position. Another style is command. In this style, this focuses on the ability of those in higher positions to make decisions that are binding on those of lower positions. Policymakers can use rewards or punishments to eventually get the policy that they want to adopt. The last style is majority building in Congress. The government needs majorities in order for a policy to be adopted. There are natural majorities, which are the political parties that have the majority in the House and the Senate, and also bargaining occurs for majorities, which would get both parties to support a policy. Next, Anderson notes the president's role in decision making. The president has decision making in foreign affairs, executive orders, and vetoing. Presidential decision making can be shaped by many factors, such as constitutionality, availability of resources, timing, previous commitments made to the public, and available information about policies. Anderson notes a couple case studies to illustrate the policy adoption process. One case study is for the Family Smoking Prevention and Tobacco Control Act. In the beginning of the 20th century, there was a link between smoking and illness. This was fended off by tobacco companies. But in 1964, the Surgeon General reported a strong tie between smoking and cancer, as well as other illnesses. Then in 1965, Congress adopted the Cigarette Labeling and Advertising Act. In 1994, the FDA regulates cigarettes because of the addictive character of nicotine. Then, with the passing of time, tobacco companies started to worry that they would lose money and maybe even be shut down. Tobacco companies were supported by Republicans who support business, while the Democrats opposed the companies and wanted to support health. In 2009, the Democrats controlled both houses of Congress. Thus, they were able to get support in both houses and eventually pass the Family Smoking Prevention and Tobacco Control Act. And this act was eventually signed by President Obama. This case study very much illustrates the process of policy adoption. Some questions for discussion include: incremental decision making is generally utilized in policy making. Do you think that rational, comprehensive decision making or mixed scanning should be utilized more often? Why or why not? And which decision criterion is most commonly used by policymakers in policy adoption?